Faeland is what happens when you take the design of a Metroidvania and then fuse it with the concept of a classic Zelda game. The story takes place roughly 1,000 years after the creators of humanity, the Fae, engage in a civil war and seemingly disappear. You're put in the shoes of a hunter named Sam, his home is then raided, and then your journey begins. Before getting into the details, I do want to point out that this review is just on the first 2 chapters of the game. Because this is an early access release, the remaining chapters will be dropped periodically with a total of 6, including the prologue sequence. With that being said, I want to talk about the phenomenal animations in this title. You can tell right from the start the developers spent a lot of time crafting each scene and area. Even though the main character is more of an avatar, as you can customize the look and name, he has expressions and feels like a character with some personality, so it was nice to see him actually react to being injured in the game's opening. Faeland does a great job establishing its settings, as the first area you're introduced to is the spider's lair after the raid. But you begin with no equipment, so it becomes a survival experience as you're introduced to the game's mechanics prior to finding a weapon. Personally, I thought this was a fun addition that helped me get accustomed to the gameplay. Now, the areas I got to explore through the first 2 chapters are full of details with both foreground and background animations. There's a nice ambience to each area as well, such as the sound of a waterfall. That being said, despite the wonderful graphics, these areas didn't strike me as anything overly unique, consisting of a forest area, a cave, and a fortress. But within each zone, you can expect to find some unique enemies, whether it be the spiders in the lair or these things in the underground fortress. Specifically, I really like the designs of the bipedal enemies such as the goblins. These enemies have more health, and each one carries their own attack and weapon. I think something Faeland does right here is that you're actually fighting against a sort of army with these, rather than just creatures native to a given environment. I also really enjoy the map in this title because it's layered. Basically, whenever you enter a cave or dungeon, only other enclosed areas will be highlighted on your map, separating the overworld zones. Within the overworld zone, you can expect to spend some time in Valia Town, where you can purchase new armor, health, and other items if you have the necessary materials. Now, you will have to run some errands for the NPCs for the main story before progressing, but this took me no longer than like 10 minutes, so it never dragged on, but rather helped me get accustomed with the town. Faeland plays like an RPG. You have your main story missions, and you can take on side missions through conversations with NPCs. However, I never actually got to complete any due to some of the limitations with the early access build. You have inventory where you can stock up on food, which is health, and for every piece of armor you equip, you gain additional hearts. Now, this game is much more story focused than the majority of Metroidvanias, but the exploration is just what it should be. The objectives aren't always marked on your map, leaving you to find the correct path. During your traversal, you'll find that the protagonist feels great to play as with some smooth animations, and although combat is simple, you'll slowly unlock new abilities that make it more dynamic. You'll unlock a roll, a backflip, and discover a shield, which can all be used when facing off with these enemies. I think by the time I was finished with the build, I was just starting to appreciate the combat because enemies became more difficult, so I actually had to utilize my new abilities and stay stocked up on health. Now, probably my favorite aspect of Faeland is the dungeons. You technically play through 2 dungeons between the first 2 chapters. However, only one actually feels like what you might expect out of a Zelda title. I think it's common for some Metroidvanias to say they're dungeons when in reality, they're usually just different themed locations. But in Faeland, you physically enter an area, and then you have to work from within it, where you'll find a new ability which you can then use to solve puzzles and then fight the boss. The spider's lair, in all honesty, just felt like an additional area, but the underground fortress was a great experience to play through. As I mentioned, I wasn't blown away by the artistic design of it, but after some exploration, I began to realize this whole dungeon plays like one large puzzle, similar to say the infamous water temple of Ocarina of Time. Yes, the starter dungeon is in fact water-based, but swimming is smooth and fast, so it doesn't detract from the experience altogether. The goal is to find 3 keys that unlock a door to the boss, but I can't say for sure up to this point if the remaining dungeons will be structured like this, but I can say that the bosses are presented well. I say presented well because you get teased with the bosses before actually facing them, setting the stage for the eventual fight. However, I wouldn't call them the most unique in design, considering one is a spider and the other is a kraken. Although the animations still look great, I'm more so speaking on the concept. The fights themselves vary greatly. The queen spider was a fairly easy experience, as she only carried a few attacks and was not difficult to evade. But the kraken, in my opinion, was a fantastic time. He has around 3 phases, each one being more challenging than the next, next, and I failed a few times before actually progressing. But what I really enjoyed here is that I got to use my newfound underwater attack during the battle, so this leads me to believe the later bosses will also be similar to this, forcing you to use a dungeon item on a given boss. You close off your playthrough soon after completing the second dungeon, and you're met with a short trailer signaling the end of the playthrough. I for one absolutely wanted to continue playing and get on to the next dungeon and do some exploring. Faeland, however, despite the fun, does have some flaws. I found the character to be a little slow for how much you have to get around, and at times the enemy hitboxes can be questionable. Regardless, this did not take away from my experience with the game. So if you're looking for a title with some actual 2D dungeons, a narrative-driven Metroidvania, and a beautiful world with plenty of exploration, then Faeland might be something you're looking for. The only thing I'm really disappointed in is that I didn't get to play through the whole game, with this being my first early access review. You should be able to find Faeland beginning December 5th on Steam. I do want to point out that the build I played will be slightly different than what's released on the 5th, but please feel free to drop any questions about the game that I maybe didn't get to. So, until next time.